By the time the ranger noticed the pale shape resting against the scorched earth, the afternoon had already begun to bend under its own weight, heat pressing down on grass and stone alike, turning every breath into something slow and deliberate. From a distance, the young lion seemed almost like a misplaced shadow, stretched thin beneath the open sky, too still for something that should have been alive and alert. The ranger slowed his steps without thinking, boots barely lifting dust, senses narrowing to the faint rise and fall of a ribcage that was difficult to see. As he drew closer, shallow movement revealed itself in hesitant intervals, each breath appearing uncertain, as if borrowed from a shrinking reserve. Flies hovered around darkened patches in the fur, where blood had dried into stiff, tangled threads, matting gold into rusted brown. The lion's flank twitched once, weakly, then settled again, and the long tail lay slack in the grass, unmoving. He stopped several meters away, lowering himself into a crouch, letting the silence remain intact. Years in the field had taught him that distance was sometimes the first form of respect. The young animal's ears were flattened loosely against its head, not in warning but in exhaustion, and one eye was half open, clouded with fatigue, tracking nothing in particular. Heat shimmered between them, bending outlines and softening edges, making the scene feel fragile, as if it might dissolve if approached too quickly. The ranger listened for sound beyond breathing. No growl, no low rumble of warning, only a faint, uneven rasp that caught and released. He could see where the skin along the shoulder had torn, likely from a territorial clash or a failed hunt, the wound crusted but still raw at its center. Slowly he shifted closer, one measured step at a time, keeping his body low, shoulders relaxed, hands open. The grass whispered softly against his trousers, and the lion's whiskers trembled in response, a subtle reaction that suggested awareness beneath the exhaustion. When the ranger paused again, he spoke barely above a breath, "Easy, boy," allowing the words to settle into the air without expectation. The lion did not lift its head, but one ear turned slightly, catching the sound, acknowledging it without strength to respond further. Sweat gathered along the ranger's temples as he studied the animal's posture, the way its paws were tucked awkwardly beneath its chest, the way its muscles seemed hollowed by pain and dehydration. This was not the posture of rest. It was the posture of something waiting, suspended between recovery and collapse. The surrounding savanna moved on as if unaware, insects clicking, distant birds calling, clouds drifting lazily overhead, indifferent to the fragile stillness at its center. A faint breeze passed through, stirring dust and bending dry grass around the lion's body, tracing gentle lines along its fur. In that quiet motion, the ranger felt the weight of uncertainty settle in, heavy but calm, as he prepared himself to act with patience, knowing that in this moment, every slow breath, every softened movement, might be the difference between fating and endurance. The stillness did not last. It shifted first as a tremor along the lion's spine, a faint ripple moving beneath dust-coated fur, followed by a slow, strained attempt to gather his limbs beneath him. The movement was hesitant, uncoordinated, as if his body no longer trusted itself. One foreleg slid forward, scraping lightly against dry earth, then stopped. His breathing thickened, pulling in air with effort, releasing it in uneven bursts. When he tried again, pushing his weight upward, his hindquarters faltered, collapsing inward before they could rise. The effort exposed what the heat and distance had hidden. Wrapped tightly around his rear leg, half buried beneath dried blood and dirt, was the thin metallic curve of a snare, bitten deep into muscle and skin. Flesh had swollen around it, inflamed and dark, the edges torn where he had struggled to free himself. Each movement tightened the wire further, drawing a low, fractured sound from his chest. Not a roar, not a threat, but a broken vibration shaped by pain and fatigue. The sound drifted across the open plain, carried by wind, fading into grasses and distant sky. The ranger's breath caught briefly, then steadied. He lowered himself even further, keeping his outline small, his presence quiet. The lion's head lifted slightly, just enough for one eye to meet the ranger's form. It was dull with exhaustion, rimmed with dust and dried tears, yet alert in its own restrained way, aware of something near, something unfamiliar, something that might either help or harm. The ranger did not close the distance. He stayed where he was, close enough for the animal to sense warmth and steadiness, far enough to avoid triggering fear. Slowly he reached for his radio, movements deliberate, wrist bending gently, fingers careful not to flash in the sun. He brought it near his mouth and spoke in a low, controlled voice, "I found him. Snare injury. Severe. I need support." The words were simple, carried without urgency in their tone, though urgency lived beneath them. When he lowered the radio, he remained still, eyes returning to the lion's labored form. The animal attempted another shift, dragging the trapped leg a few centimeters before stopping, sides heaving, mouth opening slightly to release a shallow groan. Dust clung to his whiskers. A small string of saliva hung briefly before falling into the grass. The ranger murmured softly, "It's okay, stay still," letting the sound rest between them. The lion's ears flicked once, then settled, his head sinking back to the ground as if surrendering to gravity. Around them, the savanna continued its quiet rhythms. Grass bent under passing wind. A distant herd moved like drifting shadows. Above, thin clouds slid across the sun, briefly softening the heat. In that shifting light, man and animal remained bound by patience and restraint, waiting together, breathing slowly, suspended in fragile balance. Time moved differently as the sound of distant engines softened into presence, carried gently across grass and dust before taking form at the edge of the plain. The ranger remained where he was, body grounded, posture unchanged, as two rescue workers approached on foot, their movements slow and measured, eyes fixed not on speed but on stability. They paused several meters away, reading the lion's posture, the tension in his shoulders, the shallow rhythm of his breath. Nothing about their approach suggested urgency. Every step was placed with care, every shift of weight considered. The lion lifted his head slightly at the unfamiliar sounds, nostrils flaring weakly as he tested the air. His breathing deepened for a moment, uneven and strained, then settled again as if exhaustion outweighed fear. The ranger spoke quietly, updating them in brief, steady phrases, his voice low enough to blend with wind and insects. One of the workers nodded, already preparing equipment with deliberate hands, unfastening straps, laying cloth and medical tools on the ground without sudden movement. Another crouched beside him, watching the lion's eyes, searching for signs of distress or agitation. The snare glinted faintly in the sunlight where it cut into swollen flesh, its cruel simplicity made more visible now in close proximity. Blood had darkened the surrounding fur, stiff and brittle, yet beneath it the skin still pulsed faintly with life. They advanced slowly, lowering themselves to the earth until they were nearly level with the lion's body. The ranger murmured softly, "You're doing good, stay with us." Not as instruction but as reassurance offered without expectation. The lion responded not with movement but with stillness. His ears flattened loosely, not in warning but in surrender to the moment. A low sound escaped his throat, fragile and uneven, then faded. One rescuer extended a hand, stopping halfway, allowing the animal to see and sense without feeling surrounded. When the hand finally rested near his shoulder, it did not press. It simply remained warm and steady. A light sedative was prepared and administered with practiced gentleness, the needle guided carefully through matted fur into muscle. The lion flinched slightly, muscles tightening for an instant, then releasing. His breathing slowed marginally, tension easing in small increments rather than all at once. As the medicine took effect, another rescuer began cutting away dried blood and dirt around the wound, trimming fur to expose the embedded wire. Each snip of metal against metal was soft, almost apologetic. The lion did not resist. His head rested sideways in the grass, eyes half open, watching nothing in particular, trusting only in stillness. Human hands worked methodically, fingers steady despite heat and sweat, guided by experience and restraint. The wire was loosened millimeter by millimeter, lifted gently from swollen tissue. A faint tremor ran through the lion's leg, then stopped. The ranger remained close, his presence constant, his breathing slow, mirroring the rhythm they hoped to preserve. Around them, the plain whispered with wind and distant movement, indifferent yet present. In that quiet circle of patience, fear softened into endurance, and endurance into fragile cooperation, as wild life and careful human intent met in silent agreement. Recovery did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded in small, almost invisible stages, measured not in dramatic movement but in subtle returns of strength. As the sedative softened and the treatment settled into his body, the lion's breathing grew deeper, less fragmented. His chest no longer strained with every rise. Muscles that had remained rigid for days began to loosen, releasing tension in quiet waves. The rescue team stayed close, monitoring each change without interfering, allowing the natural rhythm of healing to reassert itself. The ranger remained seated nearby, hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes attentive but calm, as if watching over something fragile that could not be hurried. The sun shifted slowly westward, pulling shadows across the grass. Heat softened into warmth. Somewhere beyond the visible horizon, a low sound rolled through the air. It was distant at first, barely distinguishable from wind, then clearer, layered and resonant. Another followed, then another. Deep, steady roars carried across the plain, rising and falling like slow-moving thunder. The lion's ears lifted. His head tilted slightly, responding before his body fully understood. A faint tremor passed through his shoulders, not of fear but recognition. The rescue workers froze in place, instinctively still. The ranger listened, eyes scanning the far grasslands. The calls grew closer, spreading outward, overlapping in subtle patterns. They were not aggressive. There was no sharpness, no challenge in their tone. Instead, they carried a searching quality, a collective call moving across distance. Within minutes, shapes began to appear at the edge of sight. First one, then two, then several more, materializing from tall grass and scattered brush. The pride advanced slowly, bodies low, steps cautious, eyes fixed on the figure resting in the open. They stopped at a respectful distance. No growls followed. No sudden charges. Tails moved gently. Heads remained level. The group formed a loose semicircle, maintaining space while remaining present. The injured lion lifted his head fully now, nostrils widening as he drew in familiar scents. A low, quiet sound emerged from his chest, rough but steady, answered softly by one of the approaching lions. It was brief, restrained, more acknowledgement than declaration. The rescue team remained motionless, allowing the moment to unfold without intrusion. One worker whispered almost inaudibly, "They've found him," the words drifting away as soon as they were spoken. The ranger did not respond. His attention was fixed on the subtle exchange happening without movement, carried through posture, breath, and distance. After several minutes, the injured lion shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he gathered his forelegs beneath him. His body trembled as weight returned to muscles still learning to trust themselves. He paused, breathing deeply, steadying himself. Then, with visible effort, he pushed upward. His hind leg wavered, testing the ground cautiously, bearing only partial weight. For a moment it seemed he might collapse. Instead, he adjusted, redistributing his balance, finding stability inch by inch. The pride remained still, watching. No member stepped forward. They allowed him this space. With another careful motion he took his first step. It was short, uneven, imperfect, but it carried him forward. Then another followed. Each movement was deliberate, guided by instinct and familiarity rather than strength. Grass bent beneath his paws. Dust rose lightly and settled again. Slowly he crossed the open space separating him from his family. As he reached them, bodies shifted to accommodate his presence. A lioness brushed gently past his shoulder. Another stood close without touching. The group began to move together, drifting toward taller grass and deeper shade. Behind them, the ranger and rescue workers remained seated, watching until the figures blended back into the landscape. The wind moved softly through dry stems. In the distance, a final low call echoed once, then faded into evening light. The hours that followed passed in gentle progression, marked by shifting light and lengthening shadows rather than by any single defining moment. The lion no longer rested with his weight collapsed inward. He stood with quiet confidence now, posture balanced, muscles responding with renewed reliability. The stiffness in his injured leg had softened into a cautious strength, each step more fluid than the last. Though the scar remained visible beneath trimmed fur, it no longer dictated his movement. It existed as part of him, no longer as a limit. As the sun began its slow descent, the savanna transformed around them. Gold deepened into amber. Long blades of grass caught fire briefly with reflected light before dimming into bronze. The air cooled, carrying faint scents of distant water and evening vegetation. In this softened atmosphere, the pride gathered loosely around their recovering member, not tightly clustered, but near enough to signal belonging. Their movements were unhurried. No one rushed ahead. No one lingered behind. The lion walked among them with steady rhythm. His head remained level. His tail moved gently from side to side, brushing occasionally against passing grass. When he shifted his weight, it was with growing confidence, testing and trusting his body in equal measure. A lioness paced beside him for several steps, her shoulder briefly aligning with his before she drifted forward again. Another followed close behind, mirroring his pace. Their presence required no display. It was communicated through proximity alone. The rescuers stood at a distance, their equipment already packed away, vehicles positioned discreetly beyond the natural rise of land. No voices carried across the plain now. No radios crackled. They watched without speaking, honoring the separation that needed to be restored. The ranger remained still, hands resting loosely at his sides, eyes following the slow movement of the group as they advanced toward deeper grass and approaching shade. One of the workers finally murmured, barely audible, "He's strong again." The words did not seek acknowledgement. They simply existed, released into the cooling air. The Pride moved as one, their silhouettes gradually softening against the descending sun. Light traced their outlines briefly, highlighting shoulders, backs, and flowing tails before surrendering them to shadow. The lion paused once, lifting his head slightly, as if orienting himself to distant sounds or familiar terrain. Then he continued forward, stride even, breath calm, no longer shaped by pain. When they reached the edge of taller grass, the group began to dissolve into the landscape. Bodies vanished one by one, replaced by subtle movement and rustling stems. Within minutes, only faint impressions remained where they had passed. The rescuers turned away quietly. Footsteps were placed carefully. Tracks were brushed aside where possible. Nothing was left behind but flattened grass and fading warmth. Vehicles departed slowly, engines kept low, blending into distant hum before disappearing altogether. As dusk settled fully, stars emerged one by one above the darkening horizon. Wind moved through the savanna in long, whispering waves. Somewhere beyond sight, the Pride continued together, guided by instinct and memory. And in the open space they had left behind, silence remained, calm, complete, and enduring.